He was repairing a fence when the orcs came. Then she whispered, "Stand with me." The rain had been a constant companion for 3 days, a gray sheet that turned the world to mud and misery. Elias worked in the thick of it, his worn leather coat soaked through, the cold seeping into his bones. His farm was a small, lonely patch carved out of the edge of the sullen woods, a place where the writ of kings and the noise of men felt 1,000 miles away. It was a life of quiet repetition. Mend the fence, tend the goats, chop the wood, stare into the fire. He had inherited the land and its solitude from his father, and he wore both like a second skin. A length of fence had given way near the creek, the posts rotted through by the ceaseless damp. He was wrestling a new post into the sucking mud, his breath pluming in the chill air when he heard it. It wasn't the familiar sound of a deer breaking cover or a boar rooting in the undergrowth. It was a wet, heavy sound, a fall, followed by a groan that was too deep, too guttural, to be human. Elias froze, his hand tightening on the slick wood of the post maul. His heart gave a hard, sudden kick against his ribs. He was not a warrior. He was a farmer, a mender of things. The axe he kept by the door was for wood, not for war. He peered through the downpour, his eyes scanning the tree line. He saw them then. 3 figures staggering out of the woods, collapsing into the mire just beyond his broken fence. They were huge, powerfully built, their green skins stark against the brown mud. Orcs, too, were smaller, though smaller was a relative term. They were still half a head taller than him. The third, the one who had fallen, was a giant. Even lying in the mud, she radiated a kind of terrible authority. She wore battered iron plate over her leathers, and a wicked-looking sword was still clutched in her fist. His first instinct was primal. "Run! Bar the door!" Hide and pray they moved on. Orcs were a bad omen, a storm of a different sort, and they brought nothing but violence and ruin. He had heard the stories in the one village he visited twice a year for salt and iron. But they weren't moving on. They weren't moving at all. The 2 smaller ones had crawled to the leader, trying to shield her body. With their movements sluggish. He could see the dark stains spreading on their tunics, blacker than the rain-soaked cloth. They were wounded, badly. He could see the ragged fletching of a broken arrow shaft jutting from the leader's shoulder. Clear's throat. He stood there for a long time, the rain plastering his hair to his skull, the maul feeling heavy and useless in his hand. He watched them, expecting them to rise, to roar, to charge. They just lay there, a broken knot of misery at the edge of his world. Dying. They were dying on his land. And that for some reason he couldn't name was an inconvenience he could not abide. With a curse that was lost in the wind, he dropped the maul. He approached them slowly, cautiously, like one might approach a wounded wolf. The 2 conscious ones tracked his movement, their dark eyes burning with suspicion and hate, but they were too weak to do more. He stopped a few feet away. "The barn," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "It's dry." They didn't respond. He wasn't even sure if they understood his tongue. He sighed, the sound a small, weary thing. He holstered the small hatchet at his belt, showing his empty hands. He pointed to the barn, then to them. He made a gesture of lifting. One of them, her face a mask of jagged scars, snarled, revealing yellowed tusks. "Fine. Have it your way." He turned back to his fence, but he couldn't. He couldn't leave them there to be swallowed by the mud. It wasn't pity. He told himself it was pragmatism. Dead orcs near his farm would attract scavengers of a worse kind than crows. It was a lie, but it was a comfortable one. He went to the leader first. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow and ragged. Getting his arms under her was a struggle. She was solid muscle and iron, and smelled of wet leather, pine, and old blood. He grunted with the effort, his boots sinking deep into the mud as he dragged her, inch by painful inch, toward the dubious sanctuary of his barn. The other two watched helpless, their gazes following him with an unnerving intensity. He laid the leader on a pile of old, dry hay, then went back for the others. By the time all three were inside, night had fallen and Elias was exhausted, his muscles screaming in protest. He barred the heavy barn door not to keep them in, but to keep the world out. He lit a lantern, its warm glow pushing back the shadows. In the flickering light, their injuries were stark. The leader had the arrow wound, but also a long, deep gash on her side that looked angry and infected. The other two had a collection of cuts and brutal-looking bruises. He returned to his small two-room house, stoked the fire in the hearth, and put a pot of water on to boil. He wasn't a healer, but his father had taught him a few things about herbs. He found a small pouch of dried yarrow and willow bark. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. When he returned to the barn with a bowl of warm water, clean rags, and the poultice, the leader was awake. She had moved. She was sitting up, propped against the wall, the two retainers flanking her like stone sentinels. The knife in her hand appeared as if by magic, its blade catching the lantern light. Her eyes, the color of dark amber, were fixed on him. They were not the eyes of a grateful refugee. They were the eyes of a cornered predator. "What price?" she rasped, the words thick but clear. Elias stopped. The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. He looked from her guarded face to the crude knife, then to the steaming bowl in his hands. He had expected fear, maybe aggression. He hadn't expected a negotiation. He gestured with his chin toward the wound in her side. "That will kill you. The mud is in it." She watched him, her expression unreadable. Her grip on the knife didn't loosen. "Men like you always have a price," one of her retainers growled, the one with the scarred face. Elias felt a flash of irritation. "Lady, if I had tricks, I wouldn't live like this." He set the bowl, the rags, and the small pot of poultice on an overturned bucket, a safe distance from them. "Use it or don't. Makes no difference to me." He turned and walked out, leaving the lantern behind. He didn't bar the door this time. If they wanted to leave, they could leave. If they wanted to die, they could do that too. He went back to his house, ate a meager meal of bread and cheese, and sat by the fire, listening to the rain drum against the roof. He told himself he had done enough, more than enough, but sleep did not come easily. He kept seeing those amber eyes burning with a pride so fierce it seemed to defy the very notion of defeat. The next morning, the rain had softened to a persistent drizzle. The world was washed clean, the air sharp with the scent of wet earth and pine. When Elias checked the barn, the bowl was empty. The rags were stained dark. The small pot of poultice was gone. He felt a strange mix of relief and Something else. Disappointment. He shook his head. It was relief. Definitely relief. He went back to his fence. The ground was soft, making the work easier. He set the post, tamping the earth around it until it was solid. He was wrestling with a long, heavy crossbeam, trying to lift it into place, when a shadow fell over him. He turned. It was the scarred one. She stood there watching him struggle. She didn't speak. She simply walked past him, took one end of the beam and lifted it as if it were a twig. Her movements were stiff, and he could see the strain on her face, but she held it steady. Elias, surprised into silence, lifted his end, and together they slotted it into place. He looked over at the barn. The leader, Graka, he would later learn her name was. She watched them. Her face a stone mask, her side was tightly bound with what looked like strips of her own tunic. The work was easier with two. He and the scarred orc Zasha, she grunted when he asked her name, rebuilt the broken section of fence. The third orc, Urka, whose arm was in a crude sling, gathered the scattered tools. They worked in a heavy silence, broken only by the thud of the maul and the grunt of effort. It was a strange truce built of shared labor. When they were done, Elias straightened, wiping sweat and rain from his brow. He looked at the repaired fence. It was solid, strong. He looked at the two orcs. They looked back, their expressions still wary, but the sharp edge of hostility was gone. He found himself looking toward the barn, at the tall figure, still watching from the doorway. He needed to secure the top rail, a heavy piece of timber that required at least 2 people, preferably 3, to lift without risking a snapped limb. Zasha and Urka were already clearly exhausted. Without thinking, he raised his voice and called out towards the barn. "Can you mend a fence?" The words were out before he could stop them. A challenge born of frustration. He expected a snarl, a dismissal, a litany of curses. Instead, there was only silence. For a long moment, the leader didn't move. Then, slowly, painfully, she pushed herself off the doorframe and began to limp toward them. Each step was a visible effort, her jaw tight with pain. She stopped before the heavy rail, looking down at it, then at him. Her amber eyes held a question. He simply nodded toward the timber. She bent, her companions moving to help her, and together, the 3 of them and him, they lifted the heavy wood. Her hands, huge and calloused, brushed against his. They were a warrior's hands, covered in a latticework of old scars, but they were surprisingly steady, deft. They secured the final rail. The fence was whole again. That act seemed to fix more than just the wood. That evening, he didn't leave food at the barn door. He brought a stew, thick with goat meat and winter vegetables, into the barn and set it down. He sat on a milking stool a distance away and ate his own portion. After a moment of hesitation, the 3 orcs served themselves, eating with a hunger that was almost desperate. They didn't speak, but it was a different kind of silence, less heavy. It was the quiet of weary people sharing a warm meal in a dry place. Days bled into a week. The orcs stayed. They were a quiet presence on his farm. They never entered his house, but they made the barn their own. Zasha and Urka, seeing his endless list of chores, began to help. They split firewood with an efficiency that amazed him, chopped down a dead tree that had been threatening his roof, and patched the holes in the barn walls. They worked with a focused, disciplined energy that spoke of a life far different from his own. Graka, the leader, healed the slowest. Her wounds were deep. For the first few days, she did little more than sit in the sun when it appeared, sharpening her sword with a whetstone, her movements slow and deliberate. She watched everything, her gaze missing no detail of his life, his habits, his small world. He could feel her eyes on him as he worked, a silent, constant assessment. One night he fell asleep at his table, a half-mended harness in his lap. The fire burned down to embers. The chill of the house woke him in the deepest part of the night. He was stiff, his neck aching. He started to get up, and then he noticed it. A cloak was draped over his shoulders. It was thick, coarse, and heavy, made of some unfamiliar hide. It smelled of wood smoke, pine, and the faint, musky scent of orc. He stilled, his breath catching in his throat. He looked toward the barn. The door, which he always left slightly ajar, was closed. He pulled the cloak tighter around himself. It was incredibly warm. It was a gesture of a payment for the food or something else. He didn't know. But for the first time in a long time, the silence of his house didn't feel quite so empty. The thaw, once it began, was slow but steady. A few nights later, Graka joined him by the fire outside his house. He was sharpening his wood axe. The rhythmic scrape of stone on steel, a familiar comfort. She sat on a log opposite him, her long legs stretched out, her posture relaxed for the first time since she had arrived. "You are not a warrior," she stated. It wasn't an accusation, it was a simple observation. Elias didn't look up from his work. "No farmer?" "My father was a farmer. Where is he?" "Dead." He said the word blunt. The lung rot took him 5 winters ago. He didn't elaborate on the lonely, quiet struggle of that time. The words weren't in him. She was quiet for a moment, watching the sparks dance up from the fire. "My father is also dead," she said, her voice low, the rasp less pronounced. "They say it was a boar's tusk on a hunt." She paused, her gaze turning inward. "A lie. They tell to the clan." Elias stopped his work. He looked at her. In the firelight, her face was a landscape of shadows and hard lines, but for the first time he saw a crack in the stone. He saw a flicker of grief, raw and unguarded. Her father hadn't died in an accident. He had been murdered, and she was running. He didn't know what to say. Words of comfort felt cheap and useless. He just nodded, a small, sharp dip of his chin, and went back to sharpening his axe. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance of her truth. And in the shared silence that followed, another piece of the wall between them crumbled into dust. The piece, fragile as it was, could not last. He found the sign a week later. It was carved deep into the bark of an old oak at the very edge of his property, a place he rarely visited, a jagged spear crossed with a broken tusk. The carving was fresh, the wood beneath still pale. It felt like a violation, a symbol of a world he wanted no part of, now branded onto his own. He didn't understand its meaning, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it was a threat. He sketched it in the dirt with a stick for Graka to see. The moment she saw it, what little color she had regained drained from her face. She knelt, her fingers tracing the crude drawing as if it were a venomous snake. "Korgul," she breathed. the name of venomous hiss. His mark. He sends scouts. They found our trail. Zasha and Urka appeared at her side, their faces grim. The quiet domesticity of the past weeks evaporated like mist in the sun. The air grew thick with a tension he could taste, metallic and sharp like blood. They were no longer healers and helpers. They were warriors again, hunted warriors. They spent the next 2 days in a state of high alert. Zasha and Urka took turns on watch, melting into the woods for hours at a time, their bows always in hand. Graka checked her armor, testing the straps, oiling the joints. She moved with a renewed, deadly purpose. Elias felt like a spectator in his own life. He went about his chores, the familiar actions feeling hollow and meaningless. What was the point of mending a coop when a war band could descend at any moment and burn it all to the ground? The scouts came at dusk, 3 days after he found the mark. 2 of them. They were massive, male orcs, clad in black iron and bristling with weapons. They clearly expected to find 3 wounded females, easy prey. Elias was feeding the goats when they emerged from the tree line. His blood ran cold. He grabbed the wood axe that was always nearby, its handle worn smooth from his grip. It felt flimsy, a child's toy against their broadswords. They spotted him and laughed, a harsh grating sound. Human, one of them barked. Spitting on the ground, we're looking for 3 stray bitches, greenskin. Elias stood his ground, his heart hammering against his ribs. He positioned himself between them and the barn. "No one here but me." He lied, his voice surprisingly steady. "Move on." The lead orc grinned, a terrifying display of yellow tusks. "He's a brave one." He started forward. "We'll just have a look in that barn of yours. Make sure you're not lying." He shoved Elias hard, sending him stumbling back into the mud. It happened in an instant, a whisper of sound, like the parting of air. Thwip, thwip. 2 arrows materialized in the throats of the scouts. They gurgled, their eyes wide with shock, and collapsed without another sound. Their arrogance had been their undoing. Zasha and Urka stepped out from the shadows of the barn, bows still drawn, their faces lethal. Behind them, Graka appeared. She was no longer leaning. She stood tall, a spear in her hand, her eyes burning with a cold fire that seemed to suck the warmth from the evening air. She looked at the dead scouts, then at Elias, still sitting in the mud. "You stood," she said, her voice flat. He didn't know what to say. He had been terrified, outmatched, and certain he was about to die, but he had stood his ground. They dragged the bodies into the woods and buried them in a deep pit, covering it with leaves and branches. No one spoke. The act was grim, methodical. The illusion of peace was shattered. They were no longer just hiding. That night, the 5 of them sat around the fire. The mood was somber. The future felt like a sheer cliff face. "You should go," Graka said, her gaze fixed on the flames. "They will send more. Not scouts this time. A war band." Elias asked the question raw. "This is my home." "It will be a tomb," Urka said bluntly. Zasha nodded in agreement. "Why are they so determined?" Elias asked, looking at Graka. "Who are you?" Graka was silent for a long time. The fire crackled, spitting embers into the darkness. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, heavy, with a weight he could only guess at. "They are not hunting 3 refugees," she said. She finally told him the truth. Her full name was Graka Blood Tusk, daughter of Grohl, the great chieftain of the Iron Horn clan. Her father had been a uniter, a leader who sought to trade and build rather than just raid and conquer. Korgul had been his most trusted war leader, a brutal traditionalist who saw his father's vision as weakness. Korgul had murdered her father, seizing control of the clan in a bloody coup. He had declared Grohl killed by a beast, a convenient lie to mask his treachery. Graka and a few loyalists had escaped the massacre. Now Korgul hunted her, the last true heir of the Blood Tusk line, to cement his power. To kill her was to kill all hope of resistance. Elias listened, a cold dread coiling in his gut. This was so much bigger than him, so much more dangerous than he could have imagined. He wasn't just sheltering runaways. He was harboring a queen in exile, a political fugitive, the center of a civil war. He felt a surge of anger, sharp and bitter. It was the anger of a man who felt like a fool, a pawn. All her watchfulness, her careful questions, she had been assessing him, using him. The quiet world they had built together over the past weeks felt like a lie, a careful construction to ensure his compliance. "You should have told me," he said, his voice tight. She finally looked at him, her amber eyes holding a flicker of something he couldn't name. Regret? No, that wasn't it. It was something harder. Pragmatism. "You would have turned us out," she stated on that first night. "You would have left us to die in the rain." He opened his mouth to deny it, but the words caught in his throat because she was right. The wounded orcs were one thing. A hunted chieftain with a warband on her tail was another. The danger was too great. The sense of betrayal was a physical thing, a shard of ice in his chest. He had made an uncharacteristic choice to help, had opened his small, quiet life to them, and he had been deceived. He stood up abruptly and walked away from the fire, away from her needing space to breathe. He stood by the newly mended fence, his hands gripping the rough wood, his fence, his home. All of it was now on the line for a cause that was not his, for a woman who had not trusted him with the truth. The fragile bond he thought they had formed felt like it was made of smoke. The horns sounded at dawn. It was not a subtle sound. It was a deep, baying roar that echoed off the hills, a declaration of intent. Elias's blood turned to ice. He saw them at the edge of the woods. Not 2 this time. 20. A war band in full armor, their iron scales gleaming dully in the morning light. At their head was a colossal figure, an orc so large he made the others look small. He wore black plate armor, scarred and dented from 100 battles, and a helm fashioned from the skull of some great beast. There was no negotiation, no demands. They simply advanced. A wave of dark iron and grim purpose. The fight was a blur of chaos and desperation. It was not a battle. It was a siege. Zasha and Urka rained arrows down from the roof of the barn, felling the first few to break from the trees. Elias, his fear, a cold, hard knot in his stomach, did what he could. He had a few snares for catching game, which he'd hastily reset. A charging orc screamed as his leg was caught, but his comrades cut him free in seconds. It was a pathetic defense. Korgul was not a fool. He sent a group to circle around, and soon Flaming arrows arced through the air. The dry thatch of the farmhouse roof caught instantly. Smoke billowed thick and choking. "The house!" Elias yelled, his voice raw with panic. It was everything he had. But there was no time. The main force was at the fence line, smashing through the rails they had so carefully mended. He fought beside Graka, his wood axe feeling impossibly light against their heavy swords. He wasn't a warrior. He swung with clumsy, desperate strength, relying on pure adrenaline. He saw Zasha go down, a sword in her gut, her face a mask of defiant rage as she fell. Urka screamed her name and charged, fighting with the fury of a wounded bear before a spear took her in the leg, sending her to her knees. They were being overwhelmed, driven back toward the burning house. His home was becoming his pyre. They made their last stand in the smoldering ruins of the porch, the heat of the flames at their backs. Korgul himself strode through the chaos, his massive broadsword dripping. He kicked Urka aside contemptuously and faced Graka, a cruel smirk on his face. "Your line ends here, whelp," he boomed, his voice a gravelly roar. He gestured with his sword toward Elias, who stood breathless and bleeding from a dozen small cuts at Graka's side. No one will follow a chief who hides behind a human farmer. The world seemed to slow down. The roar of the fire, the screams of the dying, it all faded into a dull hum. Elias could feel the heat on his skin, could taste the ash in the air. This was it. This was the end of his small life. But Graka stood tall, blood dripping from a cut on her arm, her breathing ragged. She ignored Korgul. Her gaze, fierce and unwavering, was locked on Elias. "This man," he shouted, her voice cutting through the din like a trumpet call, sharp and clear as breaking iron, "has more honor in his calloused hands than you have in your entire bloodline, Korgul." She turned fully to face him, presenting her back to her mortal enemy in an act of supreme, unbelievable trust. The world narrowed to the space between them. "Elias." Her voice was lower now, but it carried with an intensity that made the hair on his arms stand up. "My father's hearth is cold. My people are scattered. I have nothing to offer you but blood and battle." Her eyes burned into his, and in their amber depths he saw, not a chieftain, but the woman who had covered him with a cloak in the night. "But stand with me, stand beside me, be my shield, my forge, my first man, and I will be your chieftain." The offer hung in the air, more shocking than any war cry. His home was ash around him. His quiet life was a memory. Everything he had was gone. All that was left was this choice: to die here as a farmer defending his land, or to live as something else entirely. He looked at her, at the raw, desperate hope in her eyes, a plea that went deeper than words. He saw past the lie, past the betrayal. He saw the truth beneath it. She had been alone, and so had he. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. His throat was thick with smoke and emotion. "Not as your man," he said, his voice a hoarse rasp. He had to be seen for what he was. Not a subject, not a pet, as an equal. He lifted his chin, meeting her gaze without flinching. "I am a farmer, a carpenter. I will stand beside you, but I will not kneel behind you." Korgul roared in fury at the perceived insult, at the delay of his victory. But for Graka, Elias's condition was not an insult. It was acceptance. It was the final, crucial piece of a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving. A flicker of something that looked impossibly like a smile, fierce and brilliant and utterly terrifying, crossed her face. Then, as she spoke the words, a new sound erupted from the woods behind Korgil's forces. War cries. A dozen orc warriors, bearing the same Tuscan spear sigil as Graka, crashed into Korgil's flank. Loyalists, drawn by the horns, come to find their chieftain. Korgil, his attention fixed on Graka and Elias, was caught completely by surprise. His warband, stretched thin, was thrown into confusion. In the chaos, Graka grabbed his arm. Now, with Urka leaning heavily on one of the newly arrived loyalists, they broke through the disorganized line of orcs and fled. They ran, leaving the battle and the burning ruin of Elias's life behind them. He didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. They found refuge in a hidden camp deep in the mountains, a small settlement of orcs who had remained loyal to Graka's father. It was a place of grim determination, a spark of rebellion refusing to be extinguished. For Graka, it was a homecoming. For Elias, it was an alien world. He was an immediate object of suspicion and scorn. A scrawny, soft-skinned thing in a world of green-skinned giants and Graka's first man. The title, which had spread like wildfire through the camp, was a source of mockery. They looked at his calloused hands and saw the dirt of a farmer, not the blood of a warrior. They saw weakness. Elias knew he couldn't compete with them on their terms. He had no desire to. He was not a warrior. So he did what he knew how to do. He worked. He saw their weapons were poorly maintained, their armor dented and rusted. He built a small, crude forge from river stones and clay. He spent his days at the anvil, the rhythmic clang of his hammer a stark contrast to the grunts and shouts of the training warriors. He didn't just repair, he improved. He retempered blades, giving them a harder edge. He studied the way their armor failed and reinforced the weak points, adding, deflecting ridges and strengthening joints. He saw their shelters were leaky and cold. He organized work parties, showing them how to notch logs for a tighter fit, how to build a roof that would shed the mountain snows instead of collapsing under them. He used his knowledge of carpentry and simple engineering to make their lives better, safer. He didn't ask for respect. He earned it, one hammered piece of steel, one well-set beam at a time. The sneers slowly turned to grudging nods. They stopped calling him human and started calling him Maker, Elias the Maker. Urka, whose leg he had carefully set and splinted, became his most vocal defender. His hands are as strong as any warrior's, she would growl at anyone who questioned him. They just build instead of break. He and Graka found a new rhythm. She was consumed with leading her people, with planning raids and gathering allies. He was consumed with providing the tools they needed to survive and fight. They rarely had long to talk. He would show her a new design for a shield. She would tell him what supplies her scouts had found. Yet, in the quiet moments, a deep and unspoken understanding grew between them. He would see her watching him work at the forge, her expression thoughtful. He would leave a hot meal by her tent when he knew she had forgotten to eat. They were two pillars supporting the same roof, their strength different but complementary. He had lost his solitude, but he had found a purpose that resonated deep in his soul. He was not just mending things. Months passed. The small band of loyalists grew. Their victories were small but significant, chipping away at Korgul's power, inspiring others to join their cause. The day came when they were finally ready to strike at one of Korgul's main strongholds. It was a daring, dangerous plan, and everything depended on its success. The evening before the raid, the camp was a hive of tense activity. Elias brought Graka her chest plate. It was the same one she had worn when she collapsed at his fence line, a battered and broken thing. He had spent a week reforging it. He had hammered out the dents, replaced the broken straps, and inlaid thin lines of hardened steel into the surface in a spiderweb pattern he had designed to distribute the force of a blow. It was stronger than it had ever been. She stood before her tent, watching the last light fade from the mountain peaks. He approached her without a word and held the armor for her. She turned, her movements fluid and sure, and slipped her arms into it. He moved behind her to fasten the heavy leather straps at her back. His fingers, calloused from the hammer and the forge, brushed against the scarred skin of her back. It was the same simple, practical action as when he had first tended her wounds in the barn, a lifetime ago. But the air between them was entirely different. The tension was gone, the mistrust a distant memory. In its place was a quiet, solid intimacy, a trust, forged in fire and tempered by shared struggle. She settled the weight of the steel onto her shoulders. She turned to face him, her height forcing him to look up slightly. Her amber eyes, once so full of suspicion and guarded pride, now held the deep, unwavering warmth that was reserved only for him. "You have mended more than my armor, Elias the Maker," she said, her voice a low murmur, soft and rough at the same time. Like river stones worn smooth by the current, he didn't have the words to answer what he saw in her gaze. So he just nodded, his hand coming up to rest for a moment on the solid, cool steel over her heart. His heart, her heart. It felt like they were one and the same. He had lost his home. He had lost the quiet, predictable shape of his life. But as he looked at the woman before him, the chieftain who had chosen a farmer to stand beside her, and as he heard the sounds of the people they were leading together, he knew he had gained something infinitely more valuable. He had found a place where he was truly seen, not for what he was supposed to be, but for what he was. He was no longer a lonely man on the edge of the world. He was the foundation of a new one. And this time, he would build it to last,